Actually, no, we've got to think about this all together as a whole systems holistic solution, whether it's a single rural community or whether that's at industrial cluster level. It's the same, the nation is the system in itself. So we've got to have a whole systems approach from the top down, whether that's transmission network, right the way down to the end, the end of the grid, the final mile of the grid.
Welcome to Talking Infrastructure, brought to you by global infrastructure consultancy AECOM. In this series, we'll be discussing the hot topics, key projects and innovations that are helping to solve some of the world's most complex infrastructure challenges. Hello and welcome to Talking Infrastructure. We're now at season 4 of the podcast, and some things are new, like me. I'm Toby Sadler, and I'll be the new host of season 4, taking you through the next 6 episodes. But of course, things that are more important than me are our guests we have with us today. So let me introduce you to them. So first of all, we have Sarah Falconer, who is from AECOM. She's Energy Planning, Consenting and Development Lead for the firm, so knows a thing or two about getting projects to green light. So welcome, Sarah. Also, Kate Gilmartin, who is CEO of the British Hydropower Association. It's a leading trade membership association solely representing the interests of the UK hydropower industry. So Kate knows a thing or two about energy transition. And our last guest here, Dan Nicholls, who is Chief Product Officer at SNRG, described as a next generation infrastructure company that think microgrids and smart grids, and you'll be taking a step in his general direction. So let's start with Sarah. This episode, should have made it clear at the top, is about energy transition. Bring us up to speed, I suppose. Where are we in 2025? What's your take on energy transition? How are we doing?
Well, we're doing well, but we've got a long way to go still. So it's a really fascinating time to be involved in energy transition. So thanks for having me on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to having the discussion with the others as well. We've got some really big challenges. 2030, we're hoping to have the UK fully green energy led. Whether we'll get there, don't know. Not entirely convinced, but I think it's the right challenge to have, and everybody is working really hard to get more.
Okay, it's tough, the deadline, isn't it? It's 2030. Is there a sense of, as long as the movement's in the right direction and we're doing the right things, that there's probably going to be enough to get us there? What's your kind of take on where we are?
I think it's really important to have an ambitious target, and it is about the direction of travel. I agree. I don't know whether we will make that target, but I think we're all really well positioned to give it a really good go. I think it is achievable. There's lots of pieces of the jigsaw that need to be in place. We've got government to set up mission control. NESO's been put in place, which is the National Energy Systems Operator, and they're doing a great job being really directive around what we need to do to have a decarbonised grid by 2030. But it's not just about targets, and it's not just about 2030. We're not just about decarbonising the grid. We've got to decarbonise heat, transport, industry. There's just huge amounts to do, but it's all coming together, I think, really in a really exciting way. Like Sarah just said, it's a great time to be in the energy industry. We've got the new administration. They're driving things forward. We're getting huge amounts of policy coming out of government, but it's all good stuff. And industry are there to respond. We've just got to make sure that we're doing this in a whole systems holistic approach. We've got to move away from that siloed approach. We've got to move away from metrics like the levelized cost of energy, which is just a really blunt metric, and it doesn't really take into account the whole system, doesn't take into account how we've got to build in resilience into the system as well. But there's some really great people working on this. And I think the ability to collaborate through things like Teams is really accelerating that knowledge transfer as well. So yeah, really excited to be here talking about this, and an exciting time for it all.
Great, a positive, buoyant assessment there, Dan. What do you think? Is that your take on where we are?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, first of all, fantastic to be here and join the podcast. For me, my background actually started out in my sort of journey into the sustainability space was starting out in land use planning as a local planning officer, processing planning applications in a local council. And then at that point, quickly kind of spotted the opportunity to try and specialize in renewables, supporting the growth of renewables driven by state incentives like the feed-in tariff. And obviously at that time, it was all about trying to help curate local government planning policies, initiatives, support work done by government to drive forward incentives to enable the decarbonisation agenda. But now, where I sit today in my career working in a company like SNRG, it's all about the business models. And we're working with lots of different businesses that are looking for solutions. We're working with funders that are asking for their portfolios to be decarbonised. And of course, a company like SNRG and others are developing solutions that are sustainable business models that deliver low carbon as a value proposition. So for me, that's inspiring, that's exciting, and that shows progress.
Is that your take, Sarah? I mean, you're kind of central to this planning role, aren't you, at AECOM? You're getting the sense that this is people coming to you because it's a great business opportunity, not because their hands being bent behind their back and they've got to do it.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, there is massive amounts of opportunity for developers and actually for people developing their careers as well in the energy transition space at the moment. So, there are projects being put forward frequently. We are all working our hardest to try to support developers, and they're being driven both by government policy and in some cases funding is helping to drive forward those projects, government funding. But we're also all being driven by the global need for decarbonisation. So it's a sort of a two-pronged driver, really. The policy and legislative requirements, along with the need to decarbonise. So, yeah, lots going on, and the availability of resources and skills is one of the key challenges in being able to drive those projects forward.
It's a point that gets made again and again, doesn't it? This idea that we've got big ambitions, but we need the people to deliver on them. Kate, I wonder with you, because hydropower, I mean, you essentially you're the first, aren't you? The first renewable energy source from 18, whatever it was. That you go way back. Not you personally, but we could go way back. And I wonder what you're seeing, in terms of people coming into your industry. Are they coming from all sorts of backgrounds? Are people seeing this now as an opportunity to get involved with and really push these projects forward?
Well, like everyone else across technologies, we've got a massive skills shortage, and we can't bring forward people until they have confidence that it is a career for the long duration. And that's the problem we've had with things like the feed-in tariff. We have subsidy that comes and goes, and that doesn't give us resilience and sustainability within the sector. So we're seeing pumped storage hydro coming forward now, and that's going to be the biggest scale hydropower development in about 50 years. But actually a lot of our workforce is near retirement age. And we've got to bring forward this new generation of engineers through this next decade of project development. So yeah, I mean, we've obviously got the Invest 2035 consultation was out just before Christmas, so we responded to that. Responded yesterday to the DESNZ Select Committee call for evidence on workforce requirements. So we're making all these points to government to say people won't come into the workforce until they have certainty that they've got a career pathway. And I think the workforce has changed as well, post-COVID. We've got members who have 600 workers, but they're bringing 120 apprentices through because so many of those workers will move on. Because you've got a skill shortage, people are skipping between different companies, which is inflating salaries. But also there isn't that job for life mentality anymore. People don't want a job for life. They want to move around. So it's a very different time in terms of when we did hydropower 50 years ago. It was a very different job for life mentality that we have today. So we've got to work hard to skill our people up and keep them in the occupations that they come to.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, you're essentially the new kids on the block in terms of, proving an industry that works with kind of microgrids and smart grids. Perhaps let's start with an education piece. What does that all mean? What are microgrids and how are they deployed?
So, well, just before we get to that, I can't just giving you an anecdote about my son and in relation to education and experience. But so my 15-year-old son, I did the right fatherly thing. I invited him to come into work with me to do a bit of work experience last year. So I set him up with my colleagues to spend a little bit of time with him, understanding about a range of skills that might be involved in a kind of young, high-growth energy technology business. And the first thing he said to my colleague was he's not interested in working in renewables. So after I'd finished lecturing him,
as you should,
he did qualify that by saying, but I'm really interested in working in business. And for me, that's a real reflection on the space we're in. It's a really exciting, hot place to come and work. Just thinking of the skills that are required to bring forward any form of energy solution, low carbon energy solution today. Your software is prevalent, you can be an engineer, of course, you can engineer, but you need to know about economics. You might need to know about regulation, real estate, the rules concerning the environment as well. And so all these things come together with, of course, policy, regulation, law, and things relating to consumers. From our point of view, what is a microgrid? It's really about bringing together all of those different disciplines and capabilities to provide an energy solution that decarbonizes a place and does so in a way that benefits both the wider economy and people that use energy. So for me, being in this space at the moment, really exciting. It brings forward multiple kind of disciplines, brings forward multiple sectors, and that's how we're going to decarbonize our built environment.
And in some ways, that's the point you made there is really good. I'm glad you set your offspring straight in what they should be doing. But there's that point, isn't it? You're looking at an industry that previously was a fringe industry, up and coming. But actually, what we're talking about here are cutting edge technologies, cutting edge engineering, right at the forefront of developing these ideas. Is that part of the problem we've got? Do you think? So we've got a sort of people have got a misunderstanding of what we're trying to do here.
Well, I think it's a different skill set, isn't it? And I think it's a different way of thinking. And I think, on a much larger scale than what Dan is talking about, we've got these clusters, old industrial clusters that the government is helping to sort of drive forward. And that's where they recognise that actually you can't have individual component parts of the energy transition. Everybody's got to come together to get to a common goal. So, for example, they're encouraging development of hydrogen power, but at the same time, got to make sure that there are industrial users that could use hydrogen in their processing, and the government is able to or helping to collaborate to make sure that two parts come together. And the same, for example, with carbon capture. We've got power stations that can capture their carbon, but that's only good if they've got a pipeline network to take it off and somewhere offshore to store it. So it's all about that integrated systems piece on a much larger scale to what Dan was talking about. And it's about that different way of thinking that we're not used to or typically haven't been used to when we've been developing single individual projects in the past. So yeah, it's a new way of thinking, but it's an exciting way of thinking. And I think it's, to Kate's point, it's how do we get our workforce set up for that and, in the long term, able to provide the right skills to support that.
I'm excited to hear the positive messaging coming from you. If you're listening or watching this and liking what you're seeing and hearing, then please do comment and ask us some questions. We're really keen to make the content that works for you. So if we're not doing that, then there's really no point in being here. So make sure you engage with us, comment and ask those questions, and we may feature some of them in future episodes. And there is some sort of system where we can award you a Talking Infrastructure mug, terms and conditions TBC. That's going to be very exciting. Still to come.
Ultimately, you've got to deal with a scenario where most people just like go to minus. So it's got to be easy and simple, but it's also got to ensure there's genuine things to keep purposes here. And with a microgrid solution, the model allows us to fund renewable bulk storage and smart technology. Great, that's a benefit for the developer. That can reduce the cost of complying with environmental standards and deliver sustainable homes. But of course, critically, it's also got to benefit the person that lives in the home and the businesses locally.
Right, Kate, let's move on with yourself. Collaboration seems to be that kind of key part of this. So we can't have microgrids on their own, hydropower on its own, et cetera, et cetera. How do you make sure that everybody's pushing in the same direction and not sort of, as you say, using silos and trying to ring fence their own piece of the fiefdom?
Well, yes, both to Sarah and Dan's point, this is about a whole systems approach, and Sarah's is talking about that industrial cluster, which is obviously the macro scale, whereas Dan was kind of talking more on the micro scale. And we talk a lot about local energy solutions, and that's where we need hydropower. So think about a rural community at the end of the grid. How are they going to decarbonise their heat, their transport on the end of the wire? So it's about looking at what that local energy solution is, putting generation in, which might be hydropower, then putting in electrification of heat and transport as a flexible load, along with some storage and a smart system, which might be a microgrid, it might be a virtual microgrid if it's retrofitted. So it is about bringing all those things together And I think that's in terms of the collaboration, it's about setting out that vision and saying, this is what it needs to look like, and let's work back from there. This is how we all need to work together to achieve that goal and that vision. So coming out of those silos of going, okay, well, we're renewable generation. We don't think about heat. We don't think about transport. We just think about grids. Actually, no, we've got to think about this all together as a whole systems holistic solution, whether it's a single rural community or whether that's at industrial cluster level. It's the same, the nation is a system in itself. So we've got to have that whole systems approach from the top down, whether that's transmission network, right the way down to the end, the end of the grid, the final mile of the grid.
Because we're talking about changing technology in terms of solving these problems, but also changing behaviors. And Dan, I'd be interested to get your take on this, because you're talking about powering up communities, but of course the behavior of the community is changing, that we're trying to create more towards having electric vehicles, and so and other demands on the network. Just on that sort of, I guess, people's behavior, what trends are you looking at in terms of behavioral change, and how are you getting ready to meet those?
Yeah, so this is a significant challenge for us. I mean, Synergy was set up to tackle the challenges associated with electrifying the built environment. And the key challenge that we've been seeing over the last 2 or 3 years is the issue of how do you electrify a new town that you're building or a new industrial estate, and do so, and then successfully connect that site or that estate to the grid in a way that's cost effective. We're seeing, I think last year, for example, Knight Frank produced a report, which was a survey of 50 house builders, which found that more than a third of new housing projects across the UK were impacted by grid constraints. So that's around, according to their numbers, about 15,000 homes which are currently stalled because they can't connect to the grid. So that's a real problem, and that's driven by the fact that you're thinking about things like electrification of transport. You're thinking about maybe electrifying heating, hot water, and so on. Exactly these things we need to do to get away from the high carbon emission economy that we have. But that does create these problems, and that problem then sits with the house builder. And the people that maybe have the solutions are maybe the energy geeks like me that are working in a different sector. So we have to bring those sectors and knowledge together to find the solutions. And obviously the microgrid technology that we build, we own, we operate, we deploy as a solution for house builders and for developers of industrial estates and science parks and so on. That's all about managing that transition to the adoption of electric vehicles, electric heating, using technology, using renewable generation, battery storage, software control systems, wrapping that as a service to support that transition so people can get on with their lives. They can drive electric cars, they can electrify their heating, they can have smart homes, and it's not then all about them trying to find the solutions, not the problem of the house builder, not necessarily the problem of the individual resident or business. It's about a solution that supports that for everybody.
It's a lot to take on board, though. If you're a developer and you're trying to put through a planning application, and shall we go with what we used to, or shall we try the new technology and roll the dice a little bit on it? In your take, Sarah, when you're seeing people talking about planning things and looking ahead, are they leaning into it, or are they kind of waiting and seeing a bit? What's the sort of the mood would you say in people you're talking to?
Do you mean by communities or developers?
I think more in developers, in terms of, because I think ultimately, yes, you can persuade the community to get on board, but until the developer decides to spend the money in that particular direction, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, so I think the developers are motivated to develop, clean energy solutions, absolutely. But what they are sometimes lacking is the ability to invest, if you like. And I think that's where the government support and the funding has come in quite successely, I think. So, for example, government has released series of different funding streams aimed at hydrogen production, at carbon capture that I mentioned earlier. And that's really helped developers to have the confidence to invest their own money, as well as knowing that they're, going to get the support from the government to help to drive those forward. So, yeah, I think the confidence is getting there for sure. And, I think they all know that they've got to push forward, really.
But is there a bit of carrot and stick? I mean, coming from the communities as well, because people want to live in greener environments, they want to live in environmentally friendly homes and so on. So when they're looking for a new place, they say, does it have the credentials that I need?
Yeah, and the communities, as Dan said, it's absolutely, it's crucial, and it's a really critical part of the planning process is to engage with those communities and really to make sure that we're bringing them along with the development. So engaging with them at all stages, but particularly at very early stages with, site selection, kind of technology options, etc. You're never going to be able to please everybody. But you've got to absolutely, do your utmost to engage. And I think, the mood music is changing. I think, increasingly people accept that there are going to be solar farms and wind farms, in the countryside, and that old industrial areas will be redeveloped using newer, greener energy. So, I think the communities are coming along with it, but it's absolutely critical to keep engaging with them and getting their buy-in as much as possible.
Interesting. So, Kate, a similar one for you, really, because, from what I understand with hydropower, because there's such a range of options and therefore a range of scales of the way it can be deployed, some of it is going to be engaging with the community, some of it is going to be looking for a massive brownfield site to develop. Talk to me a little bit about, I guess, that human connection and how you're making sure that people are on board as well, the ultimate users, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I'm also a volunteer director with Community Energy England and another community benefit society, Rosendale Valley Energy. So I do a lot in the community energy sector space. I've run the Community Hydro Forum for about 14 years now. So that is a forum for communities who want to do their own hydropower. So we've got a really thriving sector, community energy sector, where communities undertake their own renewable energy projects. And that's really important because it's done as a community ownership structure. So any profit goes back into a community benefit fund. So you get this kind of multiplier effect within the local communities. But it's also about hearts and minds and people actually seeing a new technology, or a technology, a renewable energy technology being delivered, having buy-in to that and having ownership of that as well. So I think it is about, the key is having access, is also the key is having affordable energy for communities as well. So things like local energy markets can have make a massive difference, where people, a bit like Octopus Fan Club, there's a wind turbine within your vicinity, and if you are consuming that electricity when the wind is blowing, you get a discount. So again, it's behaviour change. So if it's really blowing, you get an even bigger discount. So people will start going, oh, it's really windy day, I'll put the tumble dryer on. So it's about connecting people to that local energy generation and then helping them understand the benefits. And I think with the energy transition, people have to really see and feel the tangible benefits of the energy transition to get that buy-in. So it is about affordable energy. It's about people having healthy, warm homes because they've got a new heat pump, and actually it's going to be cheaper to run because they're part of a local energy club and a local energy market. So we've got to bring all these different factors together in a whole system solution where we're joining all the dots. So it's not just about the renewable energy, it's where those electrons are going to be used, who's going to benefit from them. And then that community is then going to buy into the project as well. So that's on the small scale. Obviously on the really big scale, like pump storage hydro, people aren't going to be generally going to have ownership of a pump storage hydro facility. So we have to really think hard about what the community benefits from, whether that is obviously with wind farms, you get £5,000 per megawatt going into a community energy fund. But that's kind of quite a passive transactional approach, whereas actually we can think harder about the legacy. So for example, when older hydro schemes were built, they actually built housing for the workers, and then that housing is there for the community after the construction is done. And certainly SSE networks are looking in terms of their transmission upgrades to build, I think it's 2,000 houses, which will then go into social housing. So it's a lasting legacy benefit for the community. And things like that are really key to get people and communities to buy into what's happening around them. It can't be done to them, it has to be done with them.
It's interesting, you're talking about the community there and sort of educating them about where the electricity comes from, and therefore motivating them to say the changing landscape is potentially a good thing, wind farms and solar farms and so on. I wonder, Dan, you're looking at communities where you're essentially providing this micro network for them. Do they care where it comes from? Or are we saying to them, you can have a warm house, running hot water, and it will be green. But is there an interest from the people you're talking to say, yeah, but where's it coming from? I want to invest in solar versus wind versus pump hydro, whatever it is.
Yeah, well, I mean, at Synergy, me personally, we've always held that belief that if we're going to successfully transition, we have to do it with people. We can't just do it to people. And these business models that are emerging now really are starting to take that on board. And the microgrid solution is no different. In the context of a new housing estate or a new town, where we're developing a microgrid solution for that location. Of course, at that time, there's nobody there at the time you start to lay the infrastructure, but then people move in. Ultimately, you've got to deal with the scenario where most people would just like to get on with their lives. So it's got to be easy and simple, but it's also got to ensure there's genuine benefit. I think there's a key premise here. And with a microgrid solution, the model allows us to fund the renewables and fund the storage and the smart technology. Great, that's a benefit for the developer. That can reduce the cost of complying with environmental standards and delivering sustainable homes. But of course, critically, it's also got to benefit the person that lives in the home and the businesses locally. So again, the microgrid will deliver a lasting saving, equitable saving for all residents or business in perpetuity. And that's kind of the key premise of the model. That we believe in that. We have a personal relationship with the resident, and the model actually allows for community ownership. So I think, that's always been dear to my heart as kind of how we deliver models to enable the transition. And even with the fact that people aren't there on day when they move in, I think it's still a key premise of these solutions. They have to be there to make sure they support people and make a convenient, easy, low carbon, low cost energy solution.
We're talking in this example predominantly about people living in their homes and so on, and I guess the end consumer. When you're looking at developers looking to engage the expertise of AECOM, what's the driver on that? Is it saying we're trying to build, community, and therefore that will ultimately lead to homes and schools, businesses and so on? Or is it more kind of, we're looking at homes, looking at one or the other? Is it kind of holistic in their approach?
Yeah, I guess, the majority of the work that we're supporting from AECOM side, the type of work that I'm supporting on, is directly for the developers. And so, they're being driven by the need for energy security and increased energy supply. And so that's probably the main driver that they're looking at. But I think there are increasing areas where businesses, they're looking at it as a holistic area. And I think these industrial clusters are exactly, a good example of that.
I think when you talk about energy security, it's obviously something which comes up in the news quite a lot. And so something which is on a lot of people's minds. What are the big challenges, do you think, in that area at the moment in terms of the UK, and what are the solutions that you're seeing?
Well, I think the big change for us at the moment is that that the shift from traditional fossil fuels, where we had a smaller number of large power plants, whereas now we've got this enormous mix of energy generation. So we've got offshore wind farms, we've got onshore, we've got solar, we've got hydrogen, etc. And of course, with the renewables ones, they don't all produce energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so that's one of the biggest challenges really we're having to face, is how the grid supports that. So it's the ability to move energy around the country as required, and at different times of day, etc. So I think, that's the biggest shift I think we're seeing in energy transition at the moment.
Yeah, we've got some terrible weather. We just need to get it deployed and take advantage of it where best we can. I think it's the thing with hydro, isn't it? In that there's a potential there for adding to that energy security story, and the potential for storing quite a lot of energy in the network. Can you just give me the overview if you want? Because I know there's a whole spread of options on there within hydro.
Yes, I mean, we have 2 gigawatt of hydro in the existing fleet, but that has a huge amount of storage within it in terms of conventional hydropower, so reservoir, about 900 gigawatt hours, which is huge comparative to pump storage hydro.
Just give that the sense. So 900 gigawatt hours, what does that mean in terms of a town? It can be broad, but just give us a sense.
I don't think I could say really in terms of, just to give you some comparators, pump storage hydropower. So we've got 4 existing plants that are operational, and they have 26 gigawatt hours of storage. So 900 in terms of the reservoir hydros is huge. And current battery storage sits at about 6 gigawatt hours. So it's
so dramatic.
So it's really dramatic, yeah. And in terms of pump storage hydro, obviously there's about 11 projects in the pipeline, and bringing those forward would give us another 200 gigawatts hours of storage. But we still need more. I mean, as Sarah was just saying, we've just had a period of low wind last week, which meant that the spot price of energy was about, I think it was something like £1,800 per megawatt hour. So really, really expensive and not sustainable. So we want to do more hydropower. We've got another gigawatt capacity out there, and it's really important because hydropower it delivers across winter and it delivers across peak tea time demand. It's got a much smoother generation profile than wind, which can stop, and whereas hydropower has the latency of the land. Obviously it's weather driven because it's rain dependent, but the ground absorbs that rain and it goes quite slowly into the catchment depending on the catchment. So we can do more hydropower. We can also do tidal range as well. So tidal range is where you have a lagoon or a barrage and it basically holds water back. So it behaves like low head hydropower. We've got about 20 gigawatt potential in tidal range in the UK. We've got the second highest tidal range in the world, and we're not utilising that capacity, which is really it's really frustrating for us in the hydropower industry.
But it is,
yeah. So we're pushing really hard to say, actually, in those periods of low wind, the tide is obviously gravity, it's the moon, it's non-weather dependent, and actually we can rely on that generation twice a day. And actually we can hold water back as well, so it can be dispatchable energy. So low carbon dispatchable energy is the holy grail. That's what we need more of. So there's so much more we can do to bring forward the stability in the grid that we need, as we have a huge percentage of intermittent renewables powering the grid. And I also just always talk about resilience as well. And we talk about energy security. We're driven by the global fossil fuel market, which, as we know, is massively volatile. We're going into uncertain geopolitical era as we have more extreme weather events, etc. as well. So we should really be thinking about what is the infrastructure we need, not just for our generation, but the next generation and the generation subsequent to that as well. And as I said, the hydropower fleet has basically seen the rise and fall of coal, nuclear, and now gas, and it's still generating. This is intergenerational assets which are there, to give us that resilience. So I think resilience is the key term, not just energy security. We need to think about energy sovereignty and energy resilience.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Well, in a moment, we'll hear more about what needs to change to make all of these technologies, I guess, more accessible for people. But firstly, if you've been listening to this and thinking to yourself, sounds like an industry I'd like to get involved in, then get in touch with AECOM, because AECOM is looking for new talent to come and help drive forward towards net zero. And don't worry about your background so much. What we're looking for is diversity in the background, diversity of mind, of thought. And so there's some real opportunities here. So if you think, this is an industry you might want to get involved in, and get in touch with us. And we'd love to talk with you about potential career in infrastructure. First, let's move on to how we solve the problems that you guys have highlighted. Dan, I'll come to you. What's on your shopping list of, I guess, legislative change? Easy for me to say, but go for it.
Yeah, so a lot we can do within the context of the current legislation. So the first thing we focus on doing is how can we use the current rules to build the business models, to come up with solutions that can we do today. That's what we should be focusing on primarily. There are certainly some tweaks around edges that could improve things, and there are certainly some large scale changes that could be employed. I mean, just one example of a very small change that we've learned about is the rules around microgrids as opposed to your traditional distribution network operator, the main kind of distribution cables that run around the site, around the country, and then the transmission higher voltage network. Those two types of entity have a license around them that gives them statutory rights. So effectively they can install and maintain assets under public land without too much complexity. Now, if you move into microgrids, which are the technology that you can really use to decarbonize places, they don't have statutory rights. So then in each case, then you have to work with a local highways authority, for example, to secure a license to install equipment under the road. And of course, there's multiple local highways authorities across the country, all of them with different policies, different levels of resource, different amounts of time. So then that just creates a natural friction that makes it more difficult to replicate the model. So for me, I think in terms of regulation and policy, we should be looking at how do we unlock the ability to to replicate and scale these models that have come out of the need to solve the challenges around decarbonisation.
And do you think that is because, I guess your part of the industry is still relatively new, at least compared to hydropower, and so people haven't quite understood the need and therefore how to make things better? Or do you think that there's a reluctance at the moment because it's still new and emerging, and a bit like Sarah was saying, some people aren't prepared to jump fully in with both feet?
I think it's pace of change. I think, the innovation in this sector, as it does in many sectors, but particularly technology, software, energy, decarbonisation sector, the industries are there, the money's there, the intent is to try and drive solutions. And of course, regulation's not always designed with the future in mind that's potentially unforeseeable at that period of time. So for me, it's just the need to solve these problems around decarbonisation, electrification, creating solutions that enable capital to be deployed, but also for residents and individual people to capture benefit from that transition. Those solutions are what are bringing forward these problems, which is, I don't think, an intended consequence. But I go back to my first point. Nevertheless, the focus really is around using the rules as they stand today to try to create solutions that we can deploy now to solve these problems.
Sarah, about yourself, I mean, just planning in general is beset with, you say pitfalls? Is that how you way to put it? What would you like to see that world smoothed out and so that what we talk about here is some hugely positive opportunities and real kind of, actually world-changing technologies. Frustrating if we don't see them because of, bureaucracy. What do you want to see change?
Well, I think the planning system is set up. It's quite a process-driven requirement, if you like. But I think there are lots.
It's almost for good reason.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's there to protect communities that we talked about earlier, and importantly, it's there as well to protect the environment, and not just to protect it, but to enhance it as well. So that's a really important part of the planning process. But within that, I suppose there are ways that we are always challenging ourselves to be able to get projects through the planning system as smoothly and as quickly as we possibly can. So there's lots there that can be done, and the engagement with local communities and with the environmental regulators is a critical part of that. So early engagement, proper deep engagement to really understand concerns and the ability to respond to those. There's also a lot as well about what we can do in the design of these developments. So, the ultimate aim is to design away environmental and community impacts. You don't always get to that point where you've designed away all of the impacts, but at that point it's about how you identify appropriate mitigation. But I think it comes back to the idea of starting the process as early as possible, right at the very concept stage of development, so that you're working with the developers, engineers, regulators, going back to that collaborative approach. You're all working closely together to come up with a design and a project that is going to reduce the amount of impacts as much as possible and allay any stakeholder and regulator concerns. And that's more challenging with new technologies because there are more unknowns. With existing technologies, the methods and approach and impacts are better known. So that's the challenge we're dealing with.
I mean, do you see in those new technologies that they're essentially butting up against the planning regulations as they stand because they were designed even a few years ago? That's the nature of these things, that they move slowly.
Well, I think the planning regulations are appropriate to any type of technology. So I'm not sure that necessarily affects it, but I think it's about the unknown potential impacts. So, I mean, for example, there have been concerns about, risk of explosion with certain types of gases, for example, which hasn't been
concerns me.
Yeah, but and I think we've been through that, and I think people are now more and more comfortable that actually that isn't a major concern that needs to be looked into in huge amounts of detail in the planning process. But it's an example of the transition, not in the energy transition terminology, but in the process of understanding projects, new technologies, and likely impacts.
Okay. I mean, Kate, we were talking just a couple of minutes ago about the frustrations you've got in terms of wanting legislation to change so that it can really harness the various, opportunities that hydropower offers. what's top of your list of things that need to change? I guess what would have the most dramatic benefit to your world?
Well, I think that the issue we have at the moment is that regulators and the planners and local authorities don't have a net zero statutory obligation. So they don't have to consider net zero. Now, this has changed in Ofgem under the Energy Act. So previously, Ofgem didn't have the net zero statutory obligation, and now it does. So, and that's really shifted. It's really kind of turned the dial in terms of how they can plan and how they can regulate in terms of bringing forward net zero. So I think that would be hugely beneficial if the Environment Agency or planners have that statutory requirement to consider the Climate Change Act and net zero. That would percolate through all their decision making, because at the moment it's somebody else's problem. So tidal range, for example, obviously it's big infrastructure projects, and of course it's going to have environmental impact. But as long as the risk around what that impact would be and is mitigated, and actually the understanding of, well, what's the risk of not doing anything, because we're going to have potentially, coastal erosion, inundation, etc. So that needs to be considered. What's the risk? What's the future going to look like if we don't do carbon reduction? And I think that doesn't come through at the moment in terms of environmental regulations. It's very much business as usual and looking at scenarios in today's world, rather than, well, what happens in 20 years when we have got significant climate emergency and more extreme weather conditions? What's the impact then? So we are in climate emergency, and I think sometimes that really does butt against the regulators in terms of their priorities and the consideration of what their thoughts are on climate emergency.
Yeah, and also, I've been just get your thought down on this, because you're pushing ahead with new technology. What Kate says is a concern that people aren't necessarily all pushing in the same direction. A lot of companies, certainly the last few weeks, have been rolling back their own obligations. Government also has gone from its commitments aren't quite as concrete as they used to be. What message does that send to you and your part of the industry? Does that concern you?
Yes, it does. I think it concerns me as an individual as well as someone who's trying to bring forward solutions and to support the wider economy. Thinking back to my early days when I'm working in a local planning authority, one of the common questions I received from the politicians, the members of the committees, was, why can't we just mandate solar panels on every new home? And it was asked in that way. We just don't understand. It seemed to be the most obvious thing that you could do as a local authority. And actually, while you're at it, why don't you just do it nationally? And we're very aware that that's a national debate at present. I think there's a private members bill reading this week on that particular topic. So it is something that it has public and political support, but it's not something we've achieved. And this is over the course of the last 15, 20 years, we've had this conversation. Ultimately, what I've learned is of course, it does have unintended consequences. The cost of adding that technology to new build housing is a challenge. It's a viability challenge. I talked about the grid. When you start to deal with electrification, generation and demand, it creates problems interacting with the grid, and that creates very significant cost uplifts in some cases, some millions of pounds, sometimes tens of millions of pounds of additional cost for development to electrify and connect to the grid. And so the key thing here is we want to do things. The obvious thing is to put solar panels on new house roofs. Yes, it creates additional challenges for our house builders. So my response to that was, what is the solution? Can we find a way of doing that doesn't create a problem for house builders? But if we can unlock those ideas, well, let's get on with it. Let's mandate it. Let's deliver those easy or relatively easy solutions. So for me, I'm really keen to see a bit more progress in relation to taking those strategic decisions. But I think as I sit working for a company like Synergy, I'm kind of pondering, what more can we do to get the message out that say there is business models out there like microgrids where that cost can be removed from the equation. So you're not having a battle between a local planning authority around, well, what's the affordable housing level of this scheme versus how sustainable can it be? That's something we shouldn't have. We should have affordable housing and sustainable housing. And we're not having a battle with the grid saying, well, okay, I'm going to have to pay a lot of money to reinforce the grid to connect my new electric housing development. And of course, in the context of all of this is regulation around building regulations. The government is also looking to bring forward this year under the Future Home Standard, which is grappling with those issues. Should we say no more gas boilers in homes? Should we say homes should have solar panels as default? So these are big issues that the government, the policymakers are pondering on right now. And to me, there's a really strong message saying we need to take this decision. We need to push forward. We need to avoid these situations where we're building houses and building communities and towns that we're going to have to retrofit in 10 years' time, and maybe sooner than that if we're going to deal with this climate agenda that we're talking about.
Okay, well, we're almost at the end. I don't want to end up on a negative. The world's coming to an end. So let's just go around and give me your sort of positive take on where we are. Finish with it on some good news. Sarah, kick us off there. What's looking good at the moment?
I'd probably finish where I started, really, which is it's just a really exciting place to be right now in terms of the energy transition, the technology development, individual people's careers. Careers are being built on energy transition now. And I think, it's where the country needs to go. And it's an exciting place to be. I think that's my main message, really.
Get behind that one. Kate, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think similarly, we are seeing technological progress, just absolutely accelerating, and lots of different parts of the puzzle coming together. And I think that we are ambitious. The 2030 target, we started off by talking about that. I think we can do it, but it's about getting over the hump of inertia. And I feel like we have got over that hump of inertia. I mean, we've been doing this for a long time and it's been quite painfully slow progress. But I really feel like now the next 5-10 years, by the time we met back here on the sofa in 10 years' time, I think we'd look back and go, wow, that was exciting. And we'll have done so much, I think, in the next decade.
Boyd with that, and Dan, if you can trump that, go for it.
That. So for me, it's all about two things really that really energize me at the moment. One is the transition away from reliance on doing the right thing because it's the right thing, state funding incentives to try and drive our decarbonisation, to the economy saying we want to do this. And my reflection on that is we talk to some of our clients that manage large, say, portfolios of logistics shed, for example, and one of the things we ask them is what is driving your need to engage with people like us for solutions. And one of the key commonalities we're seeing is the people that own and invest in this infrastructure are asking for it to be decarbonised. So if you like, the money's now asking for a low carbon solution, which for me is really exciting. And the other thing for me is just the quality of individuals that I work with in the sector. I mean, I've never worked with more exciting, vibrant, different people with great ideas of all ages. So I'm really excited about the future. I think we've got a great segment to be in terms of the opportunity for people. And of course, we're responding really well to the problems we face, which have not gone away. There remain major challenges, but I can see how we can solve those problems. And the fact that we're dealing with multi-sector, multi-vector, private and public together now is really the way we're going to do it.
Perfect. Well, I feel warm with the enthusiasm and optimism about what's happening. We're going to have a little section on the end of the podcast, which we're going to call the AECOM Takeaway, working title. We might have to change it. So we're going to say goodbye to Kate and to Dan. So Dan Nicholls, Kate Gilmartin, thank you so much for talking to us and giving us your insights. And we will come back with you, Sarah, in just a moment. Well, welcome to this new section, the AECOM Takeaway, where we get a chance to have a little one-on-one with our AECOM guests we'll get their reflections really on the conversation we've just been having. I'm pleased to say we're still with Sarah Falconer. I have to get your title off the page because it's complicated. Energy Planning, Consenting and Development Lead. Yeah, I've got that right. So the theme throughout that, at least from my take, was the sort of whole systems approach to this energy transition world. How does that, I guess, resonate with you and the work you're doing at AECOM?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a complex system. So one of the key things that we heard in the discussion was around the importance of balancing the grid and how the grid responds to the need for all the additional energy generation that we're getting from both renewables and the more traditional energy types, and particularly how we do that during periods where there's lower wind or sun, etc. So, I mean, one of the things that we're really proud to be working with National Grid at the moment on the Great Grid Partnership, as it's called, to help them to upgrade the national grid transmission. So that's a very long commitment to working collaboratively with them, because frankly, there's no transition without transmission. And so it's really important for that grid upgrade to that's a critical part of the transition. But obviously alongside that, we're working on all the other aspects of energy transition as well. So we're doing a lot of work in the solar space, which is great. There's an awful lot of projects out there at the moment, either being consented or due to be consented. We're seeing more and more onshore wind, actually, particularly since the government lifted the sort of de facto ban on onshore wind when they came into power. So that's been a really interesting area where we're seeing more and more activity. And as I alluded to earlier, we're also supporting organisations on some of the new technologies such as hydrogen and carbon capture, both in terms of the capturing the carbon from existing power stations, but also the transportation of that carbon dioxide to its offshore stores. So yeah, I mean, that whole systems approach is absolutely integral. And I mentioned, I think, the industrial clusters being a really integral part of that. So we're doing a lot of work on, particularly in the East Coast cluster, where it's one of the two areas that the government has put a lot of funding and support in to really drive forward. And AECOM are really proud to be part of that, and play part of that story.
Yeah, and rightly so. I mean, that really just demonstrates that whole systems approach to what you've said there, which is great to hear. From the conversation we had with Dan and Kate as well, what other kind of themes came out that you were pleased to hear them also talking about, as they come from slightly different ends of the industry to you?
Yeah, that's right. But despite us coming from very different angles in some ways, as you say, there were some clear common themes. One of them was very much about communities. So the importance of bringing communities along with us in the energy transition. And sticking on the people theme, also the skills shortage that I think everybody is very aware of. And it's how we invest in that so that as a energy transition community, we're able to develop people's skills and deliver the projects of the future. So that was very much one of the key themes, was the people side of things. The difference in technologies. So that was another area. And it was great to hear Kate talk about pump storage hydro, which actually is another area I should have mentioned that AECOM has been quite heavily involved with recently. And, it's not a new technology, but it's getting some new traction again in the UK, which is really good to see. And hopefully we'll see more of some of those emerging technologies that were talked about around tidal, for example, and the like. So, yeah, that was another key theme. And then I suppose the geographical aspect of things as well. So I think I've talked a fair bit about these industrial clusters, which, have this very geographical focus. And Dan talked about it on a more micro scale on individual sort of developments as well. So same principle, different scale.
Yeah, it was interesting. All three of you had a similar mindset to solving different problems, which is really great to hear.
Yeah.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us and hanging around for the inaugural AECOM takeaway. So thank you so much, and thank you for your contribution throughout the podcast. And thank you for listening and or for watching. So if you've liked what you've seen and heard, then please do subscribe to the Talking Infrastructure podcast. Leave a review if you're so inclined. Tell your friends and family. And of course, please do share us on social media. But for now, this is the end of AECOM's Talking Infrastructure, episode 1 on energy transition. Thank you very much. Hopefully we'll see you next time.